if we can get our heads around the fact that fear is a natural thing, you're going to feel fear, but it's in those moments where sometimes if you can dig deep and push past the fear and take the action that you're considering to drive a breakthrough, to start a company, to jump into something that, is burning inside of you, those are usually the moments when we see transformational change start to take place.
Born in 92 on the block with the Sharks. Come from a different cloth, y'all would get ripped apart. You want it diamond, then you gotta get it in the dark. We dropping nuggets like Carmelo went to Rucker Park. Now we eating from state to state, we scrape the plate. I put my eggs in the basket, took a leap of faith. I took a chance, now we grow and see the impact. Decoding Success with special guests, now let's bring Matt.
Gene, welcome to Decoding Success. As mentioned before we started recording, been trying to make this happen for a little bit. Really excited to have you and amplify your message more importantly. So thank you for being here.
Great to be with you, Matt. Really been looking forward to this conversation.
Awesome. So let's kick this off. First question for you. I guess we're going to dive in pretty deep here. I'm just curious to learn what it means to you to be fearless.
Sure. Well, it's a good place to start if we're going to talk about my book, Be Fearless. And, surprisingly, being fearless doesn't necessarily mean the lack of fear, but rather the opportunity to look fear in the eye and push past it. I think when I looked at stories of great success and transformational breakthroughs, I assumed it meant the people behind them had some special quality, one of which might have been fearlessness. But the way I had looked at fearlessness was very different than the kind of fearlessness I came to understand as we did a bunch of social science around the question of, what creates transformational breakthroughs and innovation.
Is it possible to have a total absence of fear? And I mean, the reason I'm asking that, and just for clarity purposes, I remember, in my early 20s, late teens, I kind of operated in a fearless sense, but I think it was more arrogance than fearlessness. So I'm curious, do you think there could be an absence of fear?
I do think for some people, there's actually some brain chemistry that determines when and how we feel fear. So I do think there actually are some people who have a different brain makeup, let's say, but they're very, very rare. Alex Honnold, for instance, who climbed El Capitan, we did that great movie about his climb. He did it free solo. They've determined that he doesn't have some of the same fear instincts that others do. And yet at the same time, some fear comes out in other capacities for him. So I do think the sort of more natural definition of fear, or what the body's response is, can vary person to person. But what we're really talking about when we talk about Be Fearless is really this idea that, you're using sort of your intellectual power and not letting your emotions or some of those messages inside your head rule the day.
So when you talk about looking fear directly in the eyes and just like going for it anyway, what does that actually take, right? Because when fears came up in my life personally, there's the bodily and physical sensations of, am I, feeling anxiety? Am I starting to panic a bit? So on and so forth. But then also the flip side, the more mental chatter or the emotional chatter, and ego comes into play and all of that. So what does it actually take to look fear in the eyes and move forward anyway?
Sure. Well, I think what fear does to a lot of us, and any level of fear, it can be paralyzing, and it can keep us from acting on things that in life are either opportunities or challenges that we have to face. And I think one of the things I tried to draw out in the book, although it is based on 5 principles from social science that were found in, these great stories of people who've broken through, really was ordinary people doing extraordinary things. But the reason they could do those extraordinary things is because they could dig deep and push past the fear that would have otherwise kept them from moving forward. And I think we all feel that from time to time in different situations. And so the message of this book is that's really normal. It's not like you can't be great if you have fear. What you really need to do is understand that fear is a natural part of sort of what we go through in life when we are taking risks or risking failure. And that if you really want to get from here to there with something that's burning inside of you, it's going to take you getting out of your comfort zone and pushing past fear to get it done.
Now, I'm curious to learn, how do you measure how much fear is actually good for you? So for instance, if I know I'm scared to do something and I'm going into it head on, but it I'm trying to articulate this question here. Like, how do you know how much is too much?
Yeah. So, Matt, I feel like it's funny. I talk about Be Fearless a lot, but I think I need to put it out there that I am not, a psychiatrist or a psychologist.
Sure.
So, my thoughts on this really are just experiential and from what I've read of the work of others, much of which I included in my book, by the way. I think fear has a really healthy place in our lives, right? I think fear is put in us for a reason. I mean, remember, there was a time when like really big, scary animals were on Earth and you had to make sure you weren't their dinner and things like that. That's still true as I travel through Africa in some places. So fear has an important role in our lives. I think what we're talking about when we're talking about Be Fearless as it relates to innovation and breakthroughs is really understanding what is sort of reasonable fear and what is irrational fear. Recognizing it, understanding it has, a point in life, but knowing when it's yours to overcome that, to get out of your comfort zone. Because like most people, I really love that comfort zone. It's really a good place to live. But nothing great really comes from the comfort zone. It really is when we push ourselves past that level of comfort and take risks to try new things where we see innovation and breakthroughs take shape.
Absolutely. Now, on a personal note, I'm just curious to learn, what are some of like the fears that you had to overcome? Maybe your top three.
Oh my gosh. I mean, and I still do. You make it sound like it's in the past. I have to work on this every single day. But I write extensively in the book about feeling through many periods of my life. And it wasn't just a feeling, it was very real that I was an outlier. And I was aware I was an outlier. First it was being the kid on financial aid. Then it was the kid who didn't have the same academic background as others around me. Then it became the only woman at the board table. I could go right down the line in this very privileged life that I have the privilege to have, basically. There aren't a lot of people that have my background and my community that I'm still very much connected to. So that brings out a little bit of that imposter syndrome, right? If I'm not careful, that can make me feel like I'm not worthy. And gosh, I talk to so many people in so many different roles who struggle with that same thing. That's a very common fear. But, one of the things I point out in the book is that actually, if you can pivot from that, that can be a force multiplier. Why? Because you can actually really push yourself to outperform. You may be an outlier, but we see time and time again, the qualities of outliers often cause them to outperform. And that's what I try to embrace when I start feeling some of that is, well, then how can I be even better? And usually that creates exceptional kind of both effort and often results.
So just to be clear, you're kind of referring to like a mindset shift. Is that correct?
It is a little bit. I mean, I think that, again, if we can get our heads around the fact that fear is a natural thing, you're going to feel fear, but it's in those moments where sometimes if you can dig deep and push past the fear and take the action that you're considering to drive a breakthrough, to start a company, to jump into something that, is burning inside of you, those are usually the moments when we see transformational change start to take place. And for so many people, it's funny because I have a chapter in the book called Fail in the Footsteps of Giants. And what I really try to do is unpack the story of people that we know mostly for their successes, and we don't know their stories of their own fears and failures along the way. And I think any study of extraordinary people recognizes, guess what? They were ordinary. They just found a way to push past fear and failure that came in their lives.
I love this. Now, before I had asked that last question, you had mentioned fear being in the past. So I just want to get your personal take. Again, not looking for any clinical response here, but I do feel like fear does go in the past, though, a little bit. And you could disagree if that's what you believe, but I'm just curious to learn your personal perspective in regards to you doing something that has scared you or you had fear around and you've done it, and then the comfort zone has grown. Is that something you've experienced?
Yes, but let me clarify what I was saying about the past. I was saying to you, my fear is not just in the past. It's very real
Okay,
time.
got you,
I
got you, got
still
you.
struggle with it. And yeah, I definitely think fears of our past can stay with us. And I highlight very clear examples. I'll give you just two real quick. One was kind of an outward bound experience that I was having where I had to walk across I was belayed, right? So in my head, I knew I would be caught if I fell. But nonetheless, my heart was racing, my breath was, I was like shallow breathing, the whole deal. I was 30 feet high and I had to walk across a telephone pole. And, I talk about that moment as really an important moment for me because I was frozen. And again, I was belayed. So had I fallen, they would have caught me. But the guy down on the ground, I said, look, and there were, 5 people waiting to go after me. I said, I just don't think I can do this. The fear was gripping me too much. And she called up, but you can try. And there was something really powerful about those words that just made me realize I can try. And what is the absolute worst that would happen if I fail? And it was that moment where I took that first step and then was able to walk across. So for me, that was a transformational moment of facing my fear and realizing in that particular case, I really didn't have anything to fear because I would have been caught. That then enabled me to kind of basically apply that to other areas of my life where I knew I wasn't risking death. I wasn't risking, in some cases, my career or whatever. But I did have to take risks that that could become known and could become real failures. But after that day, I really looked at fear as a very different thing.
Now, do you feel like fear of failure is like the main reason it holds people back from actually moving forward?
I do, because I think it's fear of failure. And I want to go back to this point I made about people believing they have to have some special quality that they don't believe they possess. So, the story I like to tell is, both in my professional career as well as other things I've done, I literally have traveled all over the world. I've been to all 50 states. I've been to 120 countries. I've been in the teeniest, tiniest villages in the world, the most remote spaces to the biggest cities in the world. And everywhere I go, I see one thing in common, no matter where I am on planet Earth, no matter the background or the culture of the people I'm dealing with. And that is people have great ideas. They have great ideas for their neighborhood or their community. They have, in some cases, more expansive ideas about how the world could be made better, you name it. And, the only thing that typically separates one from another is this idea that gets in some people's head of, I don't have the right network. I'm not rich enough. I didn't go to the right school. I'm not smart enough. We could go right down the line. But it is really part of the reason I wrote the book, because anyone can be extraordinary. Now, we all come to it with different benefits and different advantages. I get that. But I'm here to tell you, the Lost Boys of Sudan had nothing. No one would have believed they could have led, across the wilderness of Africa into a camp and then arrive here in the United States and make a great life to go fund and help those that they left behind in Sudan. So, in one of the earliest stories that I used to draw this out, Matt, the first chapter of the book is called Start Right Where You Are. And I tell the story of a woman who was born the child of 2 slaves here in America over 100 years ago, of course. And she went on to build one of the greatest empires of her time from a corporate standpoint. It was a hair care business that she had. It was Madam C.J. Walker. And, as she went from town to town, her very life was threatened. There was no one that would have looked at her life and imagined that she would go on to do what she became one of the greatest philanthropists of her day, one of the biggest companies, over 3,000 employees in Indianapolis. It's really an incredible story. So even when I get down and I think, oh man, I don't have what it takes, I really do think about these inspiring people who started with nothing and proved anyone can be extraordinary.
For sure. I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball here, but I'm just so curious. You mentioned 120 countries, 50 states. What are your top 3 travel destinations?
Well, I'm chairman of National Geographic, so I have to be a little careful when I say what the top three are. But I can certainly talk to you about some surprises, or maybe I found myself in the moment saying I had no idea. This first one I'll use was not a surprise, but just became even more than I could have ever imagined. Antarctica, of course, tops my list. It's one of those places in the world that is special for so many reasons. I could spend this whole time with you just talking about why Antarctica is so extraordinary. And, there are ways for people to travel to Antarctica with some degree of comfort. They're not inexpensive trips, but for anyone who might have the resources or, has that as a goal in their life, it's really possible to travel there in a way that could be comfortable for almost anyone, right? And then, of course, there's a lot more adventurous ways to travel there. But so Antarctica, definitely. I love Bhutan. Bhutan only allows 50,000 visitors a year. It's in the Himalayas there. It happens to be, as you fly into Bhutan, in fact, it's a fun thing to Google, one of the most harrowing landing experiences you'll ever have, because you're right in the middle of the Himalayas and you have to kind of bank to get in. And so there are literally people who've videotaped it as they're landing because they can't believe. But what makes Bhutan so special is it is not carbon neutral. It is carbon negative. It's the only country on the planet that actually absorbs not only all of its own carbon, but those of neighboring countries as well. And it's just an incredible culture and spirit that is alive in Bhutan. But again, they only allow 50,000 visitors a year. So you have to really make plans if you're going there. And then probably one of the other places that was most special to me, again, a limited access. This was on expedition with our leader of Pristine Seas at National Geographic, that explorer, Enrique Sala. For about 5 days, we went diving 3 times a day in the Gardens of the Queens, which is off of Cuba. And it's really one of the most pristine places in our world's oceans. And when you dive there, it's like you've turned back the clock on the ocean, because the human footprint hasn't been there because Castro didn't allow Cubans to have boats. There isn't that kind of, human impacts that we see in so many other places of our oceans. So those probably are 3 of my top.
I love that. I've asked that question before and I've never had any of these responses. So I love it. I have to do my research. I absolutely love that. But transitioning back to fear here, you had mentioned looking at the footsteps of these giants, right? And the first person that comes to mind, just because of whatever, maybe actually I might have heard you say this on a past interview, you talked about Michael Jordan and how he didn't even make his high school basketball team.
Right. Went home and cried in the closet. Right.
Right. Exactly. So the only thing is, we also know Michael Jordan for winning the 6 rings, for being probably the number 1 basketball player in the history of the NBA and beyond, right? So it's almost difficult from a mindset perspective to look at the footsteps of his one failure, or I'm sorry, I shouldn't say one failure, because I'm sure there's many, but his failure in, the famous one, quote unquote, because then you see his accomplishments. So what I'm trying to...
But he had to pick himself up out of that closet, right? And go back into the world and try again. And what I make clear in my personal story is that really my greatest opportunities followed failures. I couldn't see that at the moment in the depth of that failure. J.K. Rowling gave a Harvard speech on failure. It's one of the best speeches I've ever heard. And, she talked about the dark time when she had, nearly a dozen rejections from publishers for Harry Potter. And, Oprah Winfrey, fired from television, said she's just not right for television. Can you believe it? But story after story after story like this, of really, really dark moments where it would be a very natural human response to say, it's over and I'm not going to try again. But the extraordinary breakthroughs we do see in the lives of some people and their contributions, I'm telling you, I haven't really found many stories of great success without those deep pothole moments where, I'm sure if they looked at their lives, they would have said it's never going to happen.
So in those deep pothole moments, when we do experience failure, what's your advice to someone that's tuned into this right now? Like, what should they be doing in that moment?
Yeah, well, I think to really fully talk about failure, you need to talk about risk a little bit, because we don't see breakthroughs without risk taking, right?
Mm.
By its very nature, if you're trying something new, you're taking a risk. It's unproven. You're on shaky ground because no one really knows how it's going to turn out. So I think it sort of begins before you can really sort of manage failure in your life. You need to rewind the tape back to the risk you're taking. And I put some tools and tips provided by others who are professionals in, psychology space and things like that, to sort of measure your own risk. How risk averse are you? How much risk are you taking? Is this a measured risk right now for you? That lets you kind of literally work it out on paper if you want, this is what I'm thinking about doing. And, everyone at different times in their lives can accept a different amount of risk, right?
Right.
And I think it's important to know what you're trying, but we recognize the role of risk taking in a lab environment. Let's say it's science or medicine or technology, where basically you are trying to break things. You are trying to make things fail. Why? So you can perfect it when it goes out to market. You don't want to have to deal with those failures when they're out there in the biggest possible way. So one of the things that I recommend in the book is first understand what kind of risk this really is in your life, and then see if you can chunk it down so that you can take smaller risks, that if you do fail, you can apply the lessons of those failures and move on. Sometimes some risks are so big that if we fail at them, it could really knock us into a bad place in life. And some of those risks should be taken. Don't get me wrong. I'm really glad that, people before us took some of those risks, but it's just important to know what you're doing. So I think about, we understand R&D when it comes to experimenting with, science and medicine or tech. We really need to have a little R&D mentality in our personal lives. And if we're not constantly having a little research and development going on, we're not going to advance. So that's true for small ways, but that's obviously even more true when we're trying to do something, big in our lives.
For sure. Now, we don't want to aim for failure, from a human perspective, maybe in the lab when we're testing something, but from a personal perspective, we don't want to aim for failure. But how do we actually accept the fact that it is a potential outcome?
Yeah, I think that it's really, that is like such the essence of, what we learned about what it takes to break through, is this understanding that failure may be an option. And honestly, Matt, it's almost something like, well, if I can recognize it might be, it gives me a little bit more courage to push past this, right?
Sure.
And really try. So yeah, it almost involves a conversation with yourself. I really talk about organizations here a lot, because in too many organizations and too many teams, the whole idea of failure is never even discussed. And so if you want innovation on your team, you darn well better be letting your teams know this kind of, trying and experimenting, we salute here, and you won't be fired if it doesn't pan out. So in, the organization I run, we literally had failure bonuses. And the reason for that is because we realized that in some cases we were really wanting to be out there, on the front lines of innovation and pushing that envelope. But we got to a point one year in reviewing our business plans where it's like, this doesn't really feel like this is pushing it. And so we had this green light, yellow light, red light, which are we going forward or not, basically. And we had no red lights. And if we don't have red lights, we're not trying hard enough to really, push the boundaries. So we committed ourselves that, our teams could take some of these risks. We had to discuss them beforehand, know the failure that we were, that we were possibly subjecting ourselves to. And then if they really did everything they were to do in terms of execution and it failed, sometimes we would give bonuses for that, because it doesn't feel good to anybody when you've worked on something for a long period of time, put your heart and soul into it, and it's not going to go forward. But those sometimes really need the same kind of pats on the back as those things that do break through, because you learn from those and you can apply it to other things you do.
Well, that's a really cool concept in regards to the failure bonus. And I think people that are listening to this can actually apply that personally to their lives, right? If you start up a project and it doesn't work out, you could have a plan in place to say, all right, cool. If it doesn't work out, take a vacation, go into your top drawer and pull out an envelope of money or something,
Yeah.
like, I think that's a
Yeah.
really cool concept. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
I think it is a powerful thing, but I think the power comes in just having the honest conversation up front that failure could be an option here. And
Right.
it's almost like once you embrace that idea, then that fear that comes along with failure is really put in check to a large degree.
Mm. Now, I'm just curious to throw this in here. How much do you think fear of failure is around how we'll look to society or how we'll look to our friends or amongst our peers? And I mean, I use myself as the guinea pig because I got caught up in the whole, for lack of better terms, hustle porn culture, where it's like, if you don't own a business, you're not successful or
Right.
whatever. And I
Right.
became a part of that. So when I had left my job with Daymond John of Shark Tank, I started this business, and now it's like, I found myself at times in really dark periods because I was just constantly just trying to hustle my way out of holes or hustle my way to the top. And I feel like a lot of individuals just don't want to look less than to their peers if they do fail.
Oh, no question. And one of the most public failure I've had, I was nearly paralyzed with sort of the transparency that I kind of feared around that. And it was a very conscious choice on my part to be very public. We'd had a very large initiative that the day we launched it, I had President Clinton to my right and First Lady Laura Bush to my left. It was in New York. It was big fanfare. We usually don't do things that way. They really wanted to make this a big public announcement. And it's a longer story, Matt, but after trying for some period of years to course correct, we determined that the initiative was not meeting the goals that had been set out by everyone. So I had to come clean on that and say we were walking away and we were shutting down the initiative. And I'll never forget this question you have about what will others think. I mean, I wrote a blog about it. It was called The Painful Acknowledgement of Coming Up Short, right? Because literally the government also had put funding into it. So I remember as I was getting ready to publish that, I was so wanting to just sweep it under the rug and pretend it didn't happen and not tell anyone. And my finger hovered over that, that button where you make the blog public. And I'd love to know in retrospect, it felt like it hovered there for an hour, but it was probably a minute. And it was exactly that fear that you're talking about. Fear that I let people down, fear that maybe no one would work with us anymore, fear. I mean, I could go right down the line. And that all those I'm not worthy feelings that I'd had, they go, see, we told you, you really aren't worthy because you failed. But in the end, I did publish it. And it was a true turning point for our work at the Case Foundation, because it really brought out this desire so many people have to talk about failures. I got calls and notes thanking me for talking about, taking on an extraordinary thing and being honest when it didn't work out. And so we began these fail fests, and we usually always had them with some beer and wine involved because it helped a lot. And it really was a good moment where we would get groups together under the radar behind closed doors so nobody would be outed unless they chose to, where we came clean about our failures and things we had taken on and tried. And it became so meaningful. I think those were probably some of the early roots of our work in Be Fearless.
Absolutely. And that's a really cool concept that people can take away from this too, is just like maybe getting a group of friends together, because I do believe that you sharing your truth in regards to a failure and or a success allows for someone to connect to you on a deeper level like you're doing here right now. Right. So I think people can walk away from this and maybe get their friends together or a little mastermind group professionally and just share some failures. And I mean, that alone allows people not only to connect to you, but I mean, maybe it's a form of therapy in a sense, right?
It really is, but it's also a kind of a powerful thing that's understood. There's this African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, you must go together.
Mm.
And it was this concept of we could go together, again, in different lights. Some people don't feel comfortable talking publicly about it, but creating a safe table where amongst peers, maybe in the same sector, maybe just friends, as you say, you can learn from one another. Because the other thing I will say is that, when others share their failures with me, I have the privilege of learning without having to have that failure. And that is an incredible gift.
Right. Absolutely. Gene, I'm curious, what's a question you wish more people would ask you?
Gosh, Matt, I just think Be Fearless brought out so many different kinds of questions. I think that the question, it's sort of one of two, but basically this whole idea of how do I get started? Because, the bottom line is start right where you are. That's why it's the name of the chapter, the first chapter of the book. Brian Chesky from Airbnb has said, one of the biggest strengths I had working for me was precisely how little I knew when I started Airbnb. Isn't that counter to what almost
Yeah.
taught in what your parents taught you? You got to know what you're doing. You got to, and the fact of the matter is it can be a real strength to come into something as an entire newbie where you are not saddled with the baggage of what has failed and what could go wrong, and because you're almost too naive to know. And I know it sounds a little crazy, but there are a number of really successful companies and entrepreneurs that I point to in the book who really, when they got started, really didn't have any sense of, the industry they were going into. They just had a problem they were trying to solve or an opportunity they were chasing that they saw. And I think that, that's one thing that I will also say I think is very misunderstood. I think almost any entrepreneur I've ever met, without exception, when they start a company, it's because they have lived or very closely witnessed a problem and they think they can bring a solution, right? Mm. And it's that, there was a comedian, Lily Tomlin, who used to say, I said, somebody should do something about that. And then I realized maybe that somebody is me. And essentially that's really, I think if we could work on that piece of it, which is no matter who you are or what you are, what you have in your background, chances are you've got enough to get started down a road, and that you might actually find that you're benefited from what you don't know. And if you're wondering how that can be, I just refer you to the book and the numerous stories I tell where, later on after they achieve success, people are willing to say it was what I didn't know that was an advantage.
I love this. Now, I'm curious to get your thoughts here. Do you feel like over research or just over, I don't want to use the word or the term overthinking, but going back to, I believe you said Brian Chesky from Airbnb, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Him going into the idea or to the project at the time with little to no knowledge. Do you feel like on the opposite side of that, where people just, try to gain so much knowledge and try to have everything figured out before they start? Do you feel like that actually stops people from getting started?
No question. And again, lots of science around that. I put that in the book. There's this saying that we have used, which is, don't overthink and overanalyze, just do. Mm-hmm. Now, look, data can be your best friend or it can be your enemy, especially when you're trying to break through with something new. It can be your best friend if it can, make you smarter in ways that will benefit what you're doing as you get started. It can really become your enemy if you're, waiting around looking for the data and, again, when you're trying something new, you are the data, okay? Because it hasn't been done before. So I do think it can be paralyzing. There is a woman who wrote a book called The 5-Second Rule, and there's science behind if you don't make the decision in the first 5 seconds, chances are you're going to be paralyzed by inaction because you're overthinking it. So, and I'm not here to say I'm the world's expert at knowing where that line is between thinking, which we must do, and overthinking. But I think most people know when they're kind of, getting a little bit. And I think in our Google rabbit trail world, can we ever get caught up in that? So, at some point, you got to get off the starting blocks and just do.
Absolutely. 100%. We've actually had Mel Robbins on the show. We had a great conversation with her
Oh,
about the
great.
5 second
Okay,
rule and
great,
stuff.
great.
Yeah, we've had her on, but I'm curious to learn, in regards to individuals listening to this right now, for them to get started in facing their fears and being fearless, what is like potentially a step-by-step in doing so?
Yeah. Well, as I said, I think that pay attention to if you have some kind of burning need inside of you, again, to solve a problem, something you've seen and you think you have a solution for it, or a challenge that you want to meet, which I write about, many leaders on that front. One that we're watching, in real time in this period, Jose Andres, as he's, over in Poland and Ukraine feeding the masses, as he's done in so many other disaster situations. And I tell Jose's story, he just one day said, I got to go do this. And he had no organizational background in terms of nonprofit, the kind of operation and infrastructure that he has today. So I really do think it's just a commitment that you know what it is that you're trying to go after, whether that's solving problem, chasing an opportunity. Get comfortable with the fact that there's never going to be a right moment, that you know enough right now to get started, and that each step along the way you're going to learn. Understand where you are on your own risk tolerance, as I said earlier, really do the work of, understanding the role risk plays in your life and the real risks you'll take here, and think about them. That will cut down on the fear that you have as you bring to this. And then if you have failure, it's really hard to see in the moment, but recognize that it actually may be that one time that is going to transform everything you do and turn out, to provide value in ways you can't see when you're in that dark moment. There's one other thing we haven't talked about, Matt, that I'll touch on just briefly. And one of the other principles of Be Fearless is reach beyond your bubble. We live in the thrall here in America that it's the idea of this lone genius in the garage somewhere. And that's how we got to where we are now. Could not be farther from the truth. Innovation happens at intersections when a bunch of different perspectives come together. They can cover each other's blind spots. They can broaden the perspective, overall of what you're looking at. And so I really encourage people when they're getting started to say who's not in my network, who's not at my table or on my team, that thinks differently, that can, really kind of shake it up in terms of how I look at the world, because you'll only be benefited. And now, of course, Deloitte and McKinsey have tons of data and reporting to show that diverse teams, diverse backgrounds, diverse perspectives outperform. So it's a way that you can, be a little assured that you'll have a secret edge if that is baked into what you're doing right out of the gate.
Absolutely. I love this. You actually taught me about Jose. I didn't know that he was doing that right now.
Oh, it's unbelievable. He's already served over 3 million meals, and they are going darn close to the front lines. And, his structure, and this is a great reach beyond your bubble. What he's ultimately learned is the way he can have the greatest impact is to go local and to activate the local network wherever he goes. So those are Ukrainian chefs, many of them either refugees now or staying where they are, and providing meals to refugees and people who are not able to leave their cities. It's a beautiful story, and Jose's story is a very, very powerful one as well. And just another example of a guy who was a chef and said, I can't handle the idea that there are these disasters and people don't even have basic food. And here he stands today. I've lost track. I know in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, that was 4 million meals. He's done 3 million in 4 weeks in Ukraine. So I'm guessing, tens and tens of millions of meals to date that he's provided in times of emergencies and disasters.
That's incredible. Absolutely incredible. But Jean, I have 2 more questions for you. Number one, I just want to let everyone know that link to the book, websites, all of that good stuff will be in the show notes of this episode. Do you hang out on social at all?
I do. I'm on Twitter. I'm Jean Case on Twitter. And that's what I primarily use. Of course, I'm on Instagram too, because, we have 200 million Instagram followers at National Geographic. So you can't really be a Nat Geo person and not be on Instagram.
Okay, great. I'm going
to. But I primarily use, at Jean Case.
Awesome. I'm going to make sure that all socials, websites, where people can grab the book, all of that good stuff will be in the show notes. But one last question for you. If Jean lives to whatever year she wants to live, she accomplishes all she wants to, and you've already accomplished a ton. I know that you have your eyes set on more. With all of that being said, if you get everything you want done, but you could only be remembered for one piece of advice, what would that be?
Did I leave the world better than I found it? Did I give
Mm.
opportunities to others that they might not have had otherwise?
Do you feel like you've done that?
It's been my North Star in life and my true north. But I never would declare victory, that's for sure.
Okay. I love that. I absolutely love it. Jean, I definitely appreciate this opportunity to amplify your message. So thank you again for that. Again, just to reiterate, everything from contact information to, websites, socials, all that good stuff is in the show notes of this episode. But Jean, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Hey, Matt, thanks for what you do. Love, love, love what you do. And you play a big role in the Be Fearless world as well. So real joy to be with you today.
I appreciate it.
Born in 92 on the block with the Sharks. Come from a different cloth, y'all would get ripped apart. You want a diamond, then you gotta get it in the dark. We dropping nuggets like Carmelo